China's top political advisory body tackles the country's development plan for the next 5 years. We'll look at the discussions underway in the upcoming National People's Congress. Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello. As members meet in Beijing for the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, or CPPCC, thousands of elected delegates are attending the National People's Congress, or NPC. This year, the two sessions will focus on the direction of the country as delegates offer suggestions and proposals on a 5-year plan, a roadmap for the national economy and social development. Later, we'll talk with several economists about China's transitioning economy. But for more on the two sessions, we begin with CCTV's Ming Qian in Beijing. Ming, thanks so much for joining us. Briefly, can you explain to us what the difference between the National People's Congress is and the CPPCC and why they are so important, please?
Right. The National People's Congress, or NPC, is the top legislature in China. Deputies are elected by the people, and through them, people would exercise state power. Each Congress is elected for a term of 5 years. The NPC meets in session once a year, and it has the power amending the constitution and overseeing its enforcement, enacting and amending basic laws, and also electing and appointing members to central state organs. The CPPCC, however, or Chinese People's Political Consultative Congress, is the top advisory body. It consists of members from the Communist Party, a dozen other democratic parties, and those without party affiliation. Members are recommended and decided by the Standing Committee. They are from all walks of life to have the broadest representation possible, including the search engine Baidu's president Robin Li and basketball star Yao Ming, for instance. The advisors would participate and deliberate state affairs, then the NPC votes on policy decisions. So each would have their own responsibilities. And the meeting of the top legislators and advisors each year in China makes the top political season, which is called two sessions.
So what are going to be the major issues under discussion at this year's meetings?
Well, Premier Li Keqiang would issue the government work report reviewing the job in 2015 and set a target for 2016. China's growth target is widely watched both by domestic and international audience. And the Premier would meet the press at the end of the NPC. But besides the usual arrangements, the public is keen to know the 13th five-year plan outlining China's development from 2016 to 2020. Given the country's economy is slowing and world recovery plateaued, what measures could Chinese government issue? Based on previous reports, we could expect destocking overcapacity in energy-intensive industries such as coal and steel, strong fiscal stimulus, and so on. Other topics include environment protection, poverty lift, cutting red tapes, and reforms on taxation and financial sectors. Back over to you.
Thanks. I'm sure the world is going to be watching. Thanks, Ming. That's CCTV's Ming Qian reporting. Appreciate it. Joining us from London is Stephen Perry. He's the chairman of the 48 Group Club, an independent business network promoting trade with China. And from New Haven, Connecticut, is Stephen Roach. He's a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs and the former chairman and chief economist for Morgan Stanley Asia. And joining us from Shanghai is the chief economist with the Changjiang Pension Insurance Company, Yu Ping Kang. Thanks so much for joining us, all three of you. Before we get to the questions, let's hear from the chairman of the CPPCC.
With a focus on the implementation of the 13th five-year plan, the progress of the supply-side structural reform, and major tasks of cutting overcapacity and excess inventory, leverage, costs reduction, and strengthening points of weakness will be put into effect in the 2016 plan of the CPPCC Standing Committee during political consultations.
So let's go to Shanghai first. Yu Ping Kang, we heard there a lot of focus on this 13th five-year plan, which takes us in 2016 and 2020. What's the focus? What are the key words we should be looking for here?
Well, in terms of keywords, I think people already got a clue from the CPPCC that started from yesterday. So 5 words for the big ideas is like innovation, coordination, green, sharing, open. But I think more practically, what people want to pay attention, and also I think that's what probably the NPC, the National People's Congress, will address tomorrow, are two big issues. One is the supply side reform, and the second is about economic growth. Because we have to face it, because China now is facing an economic slowdown. But according to the plan set up about 15 years ago, is that by the year of 2020, we have to achieve the GDP level to be about 4 times as that of 2000. Then by that calculation, in the next 5 years, we have to achieve at least 6.5% of annual growth. Then that's a big challenge. That's a daunting task, particularly when we are facing these economic reform and structural reform. And also, I think that the NPC basically will cover, much like in the past, will cover a broader range of issues such as poverty reduction, agricultural modernization, financial reform, etc.
Stephen Roach at Yale in Connecticut, you've been studying the Chinese economy for a long time. What's different about this plan than previous ones?
Well, I take the point on the focus on supply side efficiencies, but I honestly feel that there's a far bigger issue that the 13th five-year plan will grapple with, and that is really pushing forward the impotence to rebalance the Chinese economy away from industrial activity towards services-led consumption. If China needs to do one thing in that regard, it is to enhance its commitment to build a social safety net, retirement, health care, Social Security, and the like, to give Chinese families the confidence to put their income to work in supporting consumption. Without that, the supply-side efficiencies will actually ring hollow in terms of driving the economy to its stated goals on development and growth.
You're right, the world is watching too. Stephen Perry in London, obviously a lot of people looking for clues about the direction of the Chinese economy and development. What issues are likely to have the biggest impact on the rest of the world outside of China as well?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of them already. People get upset and concerned about the stock market, about the RMB. I think these are passing problems. I think they're inevitable when you go through a period of change that the sort that China's going through, that you will get some ups and downs and things will happen that were a little bit unexpected. But mainly it's the stability of 6 to 7% growth over the next 5 years, but the change away from low-cost exports to a more mature economy, spread more across the population in the way that Stephen Roach was just referring to. It's an economy in transition, and people should be probably less keen to judge each and every piece of news as it comes out and see it more in the context of transformation through to China's well-spoken targets of 2021. That's the first target that was set back in 1978. And I think they're well on their way to getting that right, but there'll be some ups and downs on the way.
Yuping Kang in Shanghai, Premier Li Keqiang is going to outline in front of the NPC a government sort of progress report and looking forward as well, and GDP and development as well, focusing on the new normal of a higher efficient economy, but as you said, slower growth. What are some of the specific plans in that area that are going to create this transition?
Right. So, not China. We have to admit that China now are facing a lot of problems. But we have to separate the issue from this economic cycle versus a trend. Then, what I think that Premier Li Keqiang will address is more about this economic trend related to the potential GDP growth. So then how to increase the rate of potential GDP growth is more about how to design or reform the system so that the system can work more efficiently to allocate resource from the less productive sectors to where it can be used more efficiently. So then it has to come with 3 elements, right? One is reduction. The second is addition. The third is the transfer of the resource in between. So I think that when it comes to the reduction, is a supply side reform. It's about more related to this cost cutting, the overcapacity cutting, and these destocking or de-inventory, etc. And then when it comes to the addition, as Dr. Roach just mentioned, is more about these, the change of the structural economy from these investment-driven to the consumption-driven, and then also about the implementation of these Made of China 2025 plan announced last year. And then when it comes to the transition, is more related to a broader spectrum of reform, but most importantly, of course, is the financial reform. Then also it is also related to the land reform, fiscal reform, etc. But I think that interestingly, the investors have already voted, right? The investors have already voted by the real investment decisions. For example, in the past February, the stock market in the A-share stock market in China really rallied, has a big rally, then it plunged, then it come back again, now it jitters. So I think that people around the country are really anxious, as much as we do, to know the specific plan to be announced in the next 10 days.
I want to get onto the stock market a bit later, but Stephen Roach, you've watched the Chinese economy for a long time. What specifically could you say where headway has been made in this transformation to this new normal, new type of economy, and what are the obstacles still ahead specifically?
Well, there are three building blocks for a consumer-led economy in China. More jobs by developing the services sector, and very good headway is being made there. Higher real wages through moving workers and families from the countryside to the cities. Very good progress has been made there. The third leg to the stool, though, is more problematic, and that is building a secure social safety net to give newly urbanized, newly employed services workers the confidence to spend it. And I think the 13th five-year plan must make a good deal of progress in that third leg to the stool, or the transition will be stymied and China will be stuck somewhere between the old model and the new model, and that's not good news.
And there are lots of specific policies actually addressing that sort of thing that are obviously filtering through the system. Stephen Perry, I want to bring you in on the stock market and the relation to the macro economy, because the West has sort of, at other markets, been looking and getting spooked by what's happened in the Chinese stock market and think it's a reflection of the economy. Is there some misreading here? Is there a false alarm?
Yeah, I think so. I think the issue here is that the stock market for China is a much smaller percentage of GDP than it is in, say, countries like America and Britain. And in countries like America and Britain, it's much more to do with merger and acquisition. And in China, it's about making sure that you circulate funds into productive capacity. And it's part of creating the welfare state as well, because a lot of the funds that are held in the markets will become, in due course, from the funds. So the idea that when China opened to Hong Kong, the corridor, that there was some disruption and some people tried to play some games, and those games were dealt with. It looked rather as if things were out of control. I think China expected what happened. Maybe they didn't communicate it quite as effectively as they might have done, but I don't think there's any real problem in Chinese stock markets if people understand the basic purpose of those stock markets in China, which is different from the West.
Yeah, I just want to add to the point that Stephen Perry just made. I agree with him, but the one thing that does concern me about the bursting of the stock market bubble in China is it is a setback for capital markets reform. China has a system of credit that is overly dependent on banks to allocate scarce capital. It needs a vigorous and vibrant stock market and a bond market to augment that credit intermediation process. And the stock market now is, I think, largely discredited as a viable alternative to the banks, and that is disappointing news on capital markets reform. But it is, I agree with Stephen Perry, it's not a threat to the real economy. Only 12% of the urban population owns stocks in China. That's 1/4 the ownership of, say, the United States.
I want to just bring in Yuping Kang here before we go to break from Shanghai, because a lot has been compared to what's happening now in China to the 1980s in the US with Reaganomics, Ronald Reagan, and lots of talk about supply-side economics. For the non-economists in the audience, what does that mean?
Well, the emphasis of the Chinese version of supply-side reform is a little bit different from what we learned from the classical textbook. So what it is entailed is, actually what has been announced and what has been fully discussed in the media. That includes 5 elements, right? One is capacity cutting. The second is inventory cutting. The third is deleveraging. Then is cost cutting, and then the show up of the weak points. But then sort of the capacity cutting is more related to some of the cyclical industries, such as iron, steel, ferrous metal, and cement, etc. Those industries are related to those most rapid pace of urbanization, which is kind of gone. So much of the capacity probably will never come back. And the inventory is related to the oversupply of the housing in the third and the fourth tier of the cities. Then the deleveraging and cost cutting is most related to those some called zombie enterprises suck much of the financial resource, but don't produce much. So I think that it represents those 5 elements.
This is a really important point that I want to pick up after the break, because there is a lot of confusion over it and a lot of discussion about the transition. But we do need to take a break. More of our conversation after this. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
I think we have a very constructive view on the Chinese economy. I wouldn't necessarily term it as a slowdown. It's a series of transitions. Transitions, as you well know, from external demand to more domestically focused, from export to consumer, from manufacturing to services, all those transitions underway. And we see real progress being made on all of those. Now, anytime you have transitions of those scales, even one of them, you're going to have some volatility.
Yeah, that was Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England and the Chairman of the G20 Financial Stability Board, talking about China's economy. Welcome back. We're discussing China's 13th five-year plan and the upcoming session of the National People's Congress as well. Stephen Roach in Yale, I'd like to pick it up with you. Just before the break, Yuping Kang was talking about the supply-side economics part of the reforms in China. Part of it, obviously, is cutting capacity. He talked about zombie industries. What industries are being hit? And obviously that has a lot of effects on the workers in those industries. And how is China trying to manage this change?
Well, the industries that are being singled out are the ones already mentioned, but especially coal and steel, where there's a lot of excess capacity, and headcount reductions are expected in those 2 industries alone of around 2 million workers. And, the government is sensitive to headcount reductions given its social stability concerns. But, while I certainly subscribe to the notion to take out redundant capacity, I just want to underscore the fact that in no economy, whether it was the U.S. In the 1980s or Japan in the late 1990s, headcount reduction, cost-cutting, elimination of inefficient capacity is not a recipe for long-term sustainable economic growth. It is a necessary removal of unproductive excess for a short period of time. But you've got to follow that up with a focus on renewed growth, innovation, and productivity-enhancing research, development, and investment. And China, through Made in China 2025, Internet Plus, is mindful of that, but you have to make certain that the balance between taking out inefficient capacity does not overwhelm the process of innovations-led growth.
Stephen Perry in London, I want you to pick up on that and expand, because obviously if we're moving away from one sort of economy into another, a service-based economy, a consumption-based economy, that's going to have implications for China domestically, but also in terms of what it exports as well. One only has to look at the sort of growth of Huawei within China and outside China, the big telecommunications giant Alibaba. What sort of implications do you see within China and also its trade with the rest of the world?
Well, I think there's a lot of change coming down the line. You're already seeing some signs of it. I think the point Stephen Roach were making there are very appropriate. When you talk about Reagan, you know, that brought in an era of financial capitalism. A great deal of the GDP switched towards financial services and financial markets. And what you've seen in China in the last few weeks on the stock markets is a statement from China that it's going to stay to agriculture, manufacturing, and the service industry, and the role of the financial services will be to support those sectors, not to be a profitable center in itself in the way that it has in the States and the UK. But what this means for the world is the emergence of Chinese global companies, multinational corporations. And is the world ready for them? Well, to some extent it is, but it's mainly in a negative attitude position of trying to restrain the arrival of Chinese multinational corporations taking market share. What's going to happen in time is that people are going to come to terms with the existence and arrival of Chinese companies, as they did with Japanese and German and other companies, and work out how the world markets will be shared. But for the Chinese to be successful in becoming global companies, it's the point Stephen Roach was just making about innovation. Innovation is the key. They have to close the technology gap between Chinese companies and Western companies. Will the Chinese do it? Well, I think when the Chinese government and the Chinese party put innovation as the first word in the 5-year plan, you're hearing what they're going to prioritize. Yes. And what I always say to people who say to me that China never told us they were going to do it, China is telling us what they're going to do. They're going to innovate.
It's all there in black and white. Very, very interesting. Let's bring Yuping Khan back from Shanghai. You also talked about, and Stephen Roach has talked about a social safety net, but earlier you also talked about eradication of poverty. There is an income gap in China and also a gap between rural and urban. How is the government and the party going to push forward with this idea of a moderately prosperous society by 2020?
Well, first of all, can I add a couple points, and just one point to the supply side and innovation versus innovation that two Stephens just mentioned, right? So then, the innovation, of course, is extremely important, and that also represents the future. But then, what happened in China right now is that some of the sectors have already sucked in a lot of resources, and then the resources are clogged and got locked in those sectors. So and the system itself does not release resources by itself to more productive sectors. That's why the supply side reform comes in. So I think that both supply side reform and innovation are equally important to the Chinese problem right now. And then for the poverty alleviation, I think that it has more to do with income redistribution, and in particular, then how to spend the tax revenue more wisely. But of course, we need to have a transparent budgeting system first. Then also, after that, then to spend those tax revenues not just only to subsidize the people in poverty, particularly in the rural area, but more invest in them, invest in the future to increase the human capital, for example, to have establishment, to improve the educational system and also workforce training system in the rural area so that they can have more income in the future.
Thanks so much for that. I want to bring in the two Stephens again with the same question. Let's start with Stephen Roach in Yale. This plan has a backdrop where global growth isn't so great as well. How do you think Chinese growth plans and development plans are contributing to the regional and global development? There's also, of course, the One Belt, One Road initiative coming out of China as well.
Well, I think that's a very important question. The global economy is extraordinarily weak right now, 7 years after the crisis. And so the deficiency of global demand relative to its pre-crisis trend raises big issues about for economies who are dependent on exports, like China has been, but other Asian economies as well, as the sustenance for economic growth. This is why the shift in China is so vitally important, not just for its own growth model, but for its major trading partners. if China is successful in creating a new middle class, a new consumer-led growth dynamic, that's an enormous new source of global aggregate demand for the world and Asia to benefit from, provided they can have access to domestic Chinese markets. And that's a key issue to be negotiated in terms of future trade liberalization. But all this focus on the supply side, while I don't dismiss it at all, doesn't really touch the big gorilla, and that's the deficiency of aggregate demand in this post-crisis world. And China shares in that problem, and hopefully will address that with its own rebalancing and structural change.
Stephen Perry, can you pick up on that? But also, can I throw a couple more things in the mix? Obviously, there's an anti-corruption drive also in China. There is a green initiative, which also puts a question mark over certain aspects of economic growth. And we're having this social safety net and rebalancing as well. Can all this be done at once?
If I had an hour to answer that, I could. I think the point is this, is that China's Gini coefficient, somewhere around about 4.9, the States about 4.2, Denmark about 2.5. I would say that if we think in terms of China moving from where it is towards Denmark over the next 30, 40 years, we get a sense of this distribution, redistribution of wealth of China more fairly amongst the people. At the same time, the market economy, which is the basis for innovation, the accumulation of capital, the reward for innovation, sets in train the sorts of motivations that we see in Western capitalist societies. So you've got these two things pulling at each other. It's the job of the government and the party to manage those two tendencies towards conflict. If you look at the Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road, the possibility there of $1 trillion a year of demand as the roads basic infrastructure is built, probably $50 trillion altogether over the next 30 or 40 years. And if you take the question of the emergence of the Chinese middle class and the Chinese middle class demand, Stephen Roach is absolutely right. It depends a lot on creating the proper welfare state. That will be put in place over the next 4 or 5 years. I think they're quite clear as to what they're going to do there. And if the middle class in China do become a real demand market, and there's no reason why they shouldn't, that will also have an effect on the position of the RMB as a world reserve currency. So there's a lot out there that's much bigger issues that are contained in a 5-year plan or a 1-year plan. The journey of China towards its destination is really underway, and they're going through the next phase of change. It'll be a bit rocky as they go along, but it's a pretty good opportunity. I mean, there's nowhere in the world, maybe except possibly India, which has got this kind of growth rate and this kind of population. So it takes some time to just work it out.
Stephen Perry, will end on that optimistic note. Thank you so much, Stephen Perry from London, and Stephen Roach also from Yale in Connecticut, and Yuping Kang, thanks so much for joining us from Shanghai as well. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation does continue online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter by using our special hashtag NPC or hashtag CPPCC, and be sure to check out our special online coverage at cctv-america.com. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C., and thanks so much for watching.